Well, Jim, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. I always say this, but it's a great pleasure of mine to be back home in the Eastern Panhandle. It's great to speak here today because I think the topics that we're all going to cover are very near and dear to my heart, and really central to many of the reasons why I decided to run for Attorney General. At the core of my focus in office, I ask myself one question every day: how can we best help West Virginia reach her potential? And certainly all the economic issues that we're going to talk about today are critical to allow our state to grow in the economic rankings. Now, originally, when I took office, there were some people who asked the question with some seriousness: what role should the Attorney General play relating to economic issues in the state? People didn't know the answer to that question. And to me, it was a pretty straightforward one. The law runs through virtually everything that we do. And it certainly runs through all the major issues that are currently being debated in the state right now. So the question really was, why shouldn't the Attorney General's office be right in the middle of all these issues in order to ensure that the state would employ an approach that adheres closely to the rule of law and makes some common sense ideas as to how we're going to grow our state economically? And we know that economic growth has to be our top, our second, our third issue here in West Virginia in order to start moving up in those economic rankings. Now, when you look at the Attorney General's office, we have a lot to do day to day. We have a lot of wide-ranging functions within our office. We can speak independently for the state's legal interest. We, of course, counsel state agency clients on all matters of law. We manage litigation for the state of West Virginia, and that can be all-consuming at times. We defend state laws when they're challenged in court, and we issue legal opinions to clarify ambiguous areas of law. We've made issuing legal opinions a top priority in our office, and in fact, we've probably issued more in a 2.5-year period than we saw in the previous decade. And does anyone here believe that the law can sometimes be ambiguous and can benefit from some additional clarity? Of course it certainly can. So that's an important function. But probably the one that you think about day to day, which I've taken very seriously, is that it really falls to the Attorney General's office from an enforcement perspective to ensure that when you're engaging in enforcement, it's fair and it's reasonable. There is no friends and family plan in the state of West Virginia AG's office anymore, and there never will be again. We've tried to ensure that the state of West Virginia's legal reputation improves through a number of the unilateral legal actions we've taken. We've completely reformed how outside counsel has been hired, ultimately leading to a far more transparent process, and one that saved approximately $4 million. In addition, we've worked out through agreements with Governor Tomlin and the legislature a system to return monies back to the state's general fund. And so far, in 2.5 years, we've returned over $18 million back. Once again, the Attorney General's office shouldn't be building buildings and doing $1 million worth of advertising during an election year. That money belongs to the people. And when you take away some of the untoward incentives that the office had in place in the past, I think companies start to know that. This is a reasonable, fair enforcement unit. Every single person will be treated the same regardless of political affiliation or economic status. That's important for the reputation of the state of West Virginia. Now, of course, all of these different types of authorities and tasks help lay the foundation for a state that is trying to grow economically. We know that there are many aspects of state government that have to be reformed radically in order for our state to grow economically. I think you're going to hear from some of the terrific speakers you have here today who are going to hone in on some of those issues. We know that legal reform is critical, and we were pleased to work very closely with the legislature in order to do some of the initial drafting of that and to provide some legal counsel along the way. And we're certainly not going to shy away from defending those new laws in court when they get challenged. So legal reform is one of the cornerstones to help lift our state up economically. We know that we have infrastructure problems. And while we're not involved in the day-to-day activities in terms of deciding which highway projects to build, we can sometimes perform legal work for the Department of Highways. And we can apply pressure in order to advance important projects. I've been a big advocate for completing Corridor H much earlier than was originally expected in 2034. I've argued for years that that should be complete by 2020. I think now you're beginning to hear that a little bit more. That's certainly positive. That's what can happen when you start to form a good relationship with your state agencies and your Attorney General's office. You make government functional again. And obviously, there's a lot we can do in terms of identifying fraudulent and wasteful practices within the executive branch to help pay for our infrastructure and ultimately to lower taxes in our state. Because we have to be more aggressive in terms of our tax policy in order to make sure we're competing with all the states that we touch. It's actually a little known fact to probably many people in this room that West Virginia has the highest combination of individual and corporate income taxes of every state that we touch. It's common sense then that we need to become more aggressive and lower those marginal tax rates, ultimately in order to lure more people to our state. Now admittedly, these are just small pieces of the puzzle, and there are many parts of tax policy that need to be changed. But we believe our office can be helpful in identifying some of the wasteful practices that exist in West Virginia, and helping the legislature and the governor fund those very important priorities. I'll give you just a few examples. In the first 2 to 2.5 years since I took office, the West Virginia Office of Attorney General had received 0 referrals on Medicaid fraud to our office. 0. Does anyone here think that there's not a tremendous amount of Medicaid fraud out there? There is. We can fund a lot of priorities if we become more serious going after Medicaid fraud. That's something I care very passionately about. Now, there's a lot of good work that's being done by the existing Medicaid fraud unit, but it can be better. We can look at the models that are in place in other states, and we can go after that fraud in a much more proactive way. It doesn't just have to be pay and chase. We can use better technology in order to get on top of the fraud before it exists in the first place. The AG's office should be let loose to go after that important function, and I look forward to working with the legislature and the governor to seeing that happen. The next issue, which to me is really common sense, is that the state of West Virginia needs to accelerate dramatically the number of audits that are in place on mandatory spending unit functions. The reality is that there was some good progress made this year in the legislature in terms of the proposed audit of the Highway Department, but much more needs to be done. And why do I say this? Well, obviously, as the Attorney General of the state of West Virginia, we don't get to talk about attorney-client information. I can't come out and always point out some of the problematic practices because I'm bound by the attorney-client privilege. But when the Attorney General says that audits for more state agencies are desperately needed, shouldn't some more people pay attention? I certainly hope so. There's a lot of waste that needs to get rooted out in some of the executive branch agencies. And I think that if we identify that and bring in and stop some of the liabilities that are piling up at this minute in this state government, I think we're going to be much better off. So I would ask the legislature to build on the good success that they've had in terms of starting that audit process and invest a little bit more. We know that we're paying more per capita in state government than virtually any other state in the country. We can do better. And the Attorney General's office currently is charged under the statute to work with the legislative auditor to make that happen. We'll do anything to identify those savings so we can apply them for better purposes, lower taxes, more infrastructure, things that are, of course, sorely needed here in the Panhandle and across the state. So we can do a lot within the AG's office just through some of the existing authorities we have and going after fraud, waste, and abuse. What are some of the other issues that we can be involved in and help out? Well, regulatory reform is certainly very high on that list. We have to once again make sure that the businesses that are located in our state are functioning in a competitive manner. We have to be mindful of what happens in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Maryland, our neighboring states. Because if we are, we can shave just a point or two off the cost of doing business. We're going to be in a much better position. And obviously, through our existing work within the offices, maybe there's a way we can run the railroad just a little bit more efficiently. That's terrific. This isn't about singling anyone out. A lot of good people working in state government, but we can certainly become much more efficient. Then there's another issue, which I think probably touches everyone here in this room, and that's substance abuse. Right now, there are so many good efforts underway in the state of West Virginia to address substance abuse, and we know that there are people working on it from a supply, a demand, and an educational perspective. But I think there's something that's still fundamentally missing. Clearly, the governor's doing good work, the U.S. attorney's offices, the prosecutors, the sheriffs, our office is chipping in wherever we can, but we're missing something. I would ask everyone here in this room who is involved in local and state government to define who's running the war against substance abuse in West Virginia. We need much better coordination on a state level to make sure that all the good efforts of the governor and the local officials are being used for good purposes. I think that's the number one issue I've heard about in all of my town halls that I've traveled across the state. Everyone keeps saying, let's coordinate just a little bit better on a substance abuse side. I think we can do it. Regardless of whether it's the AG's office or someone in the governor's office, it's something that needs to be elevated in profile. And I could go on and on about a number of substantive issues relating to healthcare and to talk about some of the different work we have, regulatory reform in light of the new Supreme Court decision with the dental board. That's actually going to be something we'll have to look at to make sure we can have a smarter, more efficient government. But of course, in all of these areas, I function as the state's chief lawyer. I'm not in charge of policy. I'm not the legislature. I'm not the governor. So I want to make sure that we're still staying within our lanes. But by virtue of being the state's lawyer, you see a lot of problems in the state. And I'm certainly never going to shy away from talking about it, because we've had decades of dysfunction that absolutely needs to be reversed. Now, what are some of the other things that maybe we can think about as we get to some of the speakers here tonight? I think one thing we can't leave behind here in the Eastern Panhandle is the importance of our state's energy reserves. And I've made fighting the EPA whenever they violate the rule of law a top priority in my office. One of the ways that West Virginia is going to compete more effectively with other states across the country is through cheap, abundant sources of energy. So that means we have to be very mindful of what's happening out in Washington. That's why our office has put so much time in to legal challenges to the Waters of the United States rule and to the president's so-called Clean Power Plan. Both of those major initiatives will have an absolute dampening effect on economic growth here in the state at a time when we need most to have a removal of a lot of these regulatory burdens. Pay close attention in the upcoming weeks and months ahead as we drill down on these critical issues. But it's important to make sure that we're keeping Washington out whenever they are overstepping their bounds. I firmly believe that West Virginia citizens and state government are better positioned to manage these critical issues. So we have a lot of work that we have to do. Energy is a top priority. Tax reform, once again, I tell people I'm not the money man of the state. I'm just the lawyer to the money man. And so what's critical is, once again, we find that waste and we go after it very aggressively. That means that we start to do those audits. That means that we become more aggressive in terms of looking at Medicaid fraud. And it also means that we're willing to take on some of the challenges as pertaining to our largest state agencies that are spending more per capita than most other agencies across the country. So we have a lot of work that we have to do in front of us. But I think we have a good team in place. You have a legislature this year that's begun to tackle some of the toughest issues. I think they made great progress in the area of legal reform. They're beginning to address issues pertaining to the absolute lack of competitiveness of our tax code. And I know they're going to be very supportive of our efforts to ensure that we're protecting our energy resources and that we're defeating this administration whenever they cross the line and put our citizens in jeopardy. So it's my great pleasure to be here today to talk about these issues because I think they're all central to economic growth advancing in both the Eastern Panhandle and across the great state of West Virginia. It's been my pleasure to serve as your State Attorney General for the past 2.5 years, and of course it's always been terrific to be from this beautiful part of the state. I always say my heart beats just a little bit faster as I drive back home, and I'm glad to see a lot of very familiar faces in the room today. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to taking any questions. I don't know if we have time for questions, or if we do that.